All right, everyone. So hopefully you had an opportunity to get settled in because I am so excited about the conversation we're going to have today. First of all, let me introduce myself and our wonderful panelists. And so again, welcome everybody. We are so thrilled that all of you are joining us for this important and timely conversation. Diversity, equity, and inclusion in science and technology. This is a discussion part of the 2021 Conference on Religion, Ethics, and Science. My name is Vanessa Ruiz, and I'm the Director for Diversity Initiatives and Community Engagement at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication right here at ASU. And again, I am so excited to help moderate this discussion with our special invited guests today. Three incredible women who are doing work that is necessary, again, and important, both in their chosen fields and in the spaces they have created along the way for themselves and others when it comes to equity and inclusion in science and technology. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Elaine, let's begin with you. So if you can please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work.
Vanessa, thanks so much for moderating this panel, and thanks to the other panelists as well. This is a really important conversation. I couldn't agree with you more. My name is Elaine Howard Ecklund, and I am a professor of sociology at Rice University, where I also serve as the director of the Religion and Public Life program. And for about the past 15 years, I have been studying scientists and what they think about issues of religion and religion in society, ethics, and the ethical applications of their work, as well as gender and race diversity in science. In addition, our team at Rice University has also been engaged in studies of what religious people think about science and issues of religion and race discrimination and gender discrimination. So really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and to contributing some of my own insights as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Elaine. We are so happy that you are joining us today for this discussion. Patricia, your turn.
Okay, first mistake of the Zoom era, not checking mute. I am delighted to be here. I am Patricia Rankin. I am the chair of the physics department here at ASU, and I am very excited to be in this distinguished company of the other panelists who I'm hoping to learn a lot from. I grew up in the United Kingdom. I went to an all-girls school from ages 11 to 18, which I credit with giving me a very interesting perspective on physics, because when I went to physics at university, I actually did not realize that the majority of people studying physics were male, because all of my teachers and all of my classmates had been women. I would say that I come at this as an experimentalist, because that's my background in physics, and as somebody who is evidence-driven. So I moved through the role model era, where the theory was if you could get some women into physics, women would follow. That was an abject failure. I was also part of the fix the women era, which was if we look at the things that women don't learn how to do, like negotiation, and teach them how to do that, we will get more women into physics. That was a little bit more of a success, but not a total success. And I am now very strongly a member of the We Need to Fix the Organizations school of how to improve equity and inclusion. And with that, I'm happy to throw it over back to Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
Are we allowed to interrupt and say amen?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Patricia and I are on the same page with the fixing the organizations. That's what sociologists say.
Wonderful. And if you have any other amens to interrupt with, feel free. Okay, Elaine? And Tara, thank you also for joining us today. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. I want to say I'm living the dream. To be in conversation with these fine women, it's a dream. And so I'm honored to be here, and thank you for this opportunity. I come to you with over 20 years of experience, even though I would argue that I still look 18. I started my career in the United States teaching for 13 years, STEM, science education, in an inner city school. got tired, moved to Ghana, which is the home country of my husband, and taught there for 7 years. That's where I really developed my appreciation of what diversity meant, what equity meant, and definitely inclusion. And so I really feel fortunate that I've had that opportunity to remove myself from the United States and be able to be in an environment where I taught 65 different nationalities and to understand and appreciate what I needed to do as a educator to accommodate for the needs of my students who were diverse. And so it wasn't until I had that experience. I'm currently a postdoc at the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology, where I am blessed to be a part of that community to do the work, which is focused on how do we help girls and women of color be represented more within the STEM education. And so again, I'm still living the dream. I don't think it's by accident that I'm here today with you. And again, I just want to thank you for this opportunity and turn it back over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Tara. We're thrilled that you are here today with us, part of this important conversation. So I'd like to begin officially with a question that I would like the three of you to answer, actually. And we've had some previous conversations, and I was really intrigued with the way that this particular question was phrased, right? So what was the critical incident, right? And I think that's so poignant, right? What was the critical incident that brought you to DEI work in STEM? And Elaine, we can start with you. And then, as I mentioned, I'd like for the three of you to share that particular experience with our audience.
Thank you, Tara, for your remarks. Wow, to have an educator on the panel is incredible. So I too feel just so fortunate to be with both of you on this panel. So I started out studying what scientists think about religion about 15 years ago, and I wrote a book on that topic called Science versus Religion, what what scientists really think. And I remember one of the interviews I was doing for that study, and I had cared a lot about diversity. I was a student of race and ethnic diversity. I come from a racially diverse family. So I feel like, I'm one of the ones who, was thinking about these things to some extent. And let me tell you how I was humbled. I was interviewing a man, a scientist, and on the phone, and I asked him his race. Keep in mind that I was doing a study with about 2,500 scientists. And he said, I'm not able to tell you what my race is. And I said, well, these are confidential data. These things are reported in the aggregate. Your race won't identify you. And he said, well, it will identify me because you see, I am one of only 3 Black men in this area of physics in the entire United States. Well, I thought that cannot possibly be true. I went home and asked my husband, I didn't tell you all this, but my husband is a physicist as well. So I love science so much, I married one. But in any case, that's a crucial piece of the story. I asked my husband, name for me the 3 Black men in this area of physics, just as a little side thing to myself to kind of test what this man had said. And he said that man's name second. So that's what it means to have so few. And it sort of like sent chills up my spine to realize how marginalization really happens. And I kind of became obsessed with this and thinking through both racial diversity in science alongside gender diversity in science and other kinds of diversity in science and the ways in which these things overlap and lead to unique forms of marginalization, and just the incredible importance of having a diverse scientific workforce, both for the scientific community, but really for all of us.
I would say, Elaine, that is a situation that would humble anyone, I think. Patricia, can you please share with us what was that critical moment in your life and in your career that defined this particular work for you?
So I will say I went through my early career blissfully ignorant, I think, about a lot of the issues. As I said, I went to an all-girls school where everybody very much encouraged women to go into science and engineering and go on to university. I was very fortunate at Imperial College to find mentors who encouraged me. I came over to the States as a postdoc. And again, I would say I was probably very visible because there were a lot of people around me who were actually encouraging me and also were conscious of the fact there weren't very many women in physics and that that was an issue, and I think went out of their way to highlight my contributions. So by the time I was becoming an assistant professor and then getting promoted and tenured, I had had a lot of positive encouragement to be a physicist. I'm also going to say that in retrospect, when I look back on my experiences, I am very well aware that there were women who were equally qualified, who didn't get the same combination of circumstances, and who could have been successful with a little bit more encouragement, who didn't get it. So I am aware that I basically took my success as being down to the fact that I worked extra hard, and there was an element of having been incredibly fortunate to make the right connections in that. And I keep thinking about that in terms of how I view moving on in the future. So I actually got to the point where I was in charge of a search for a professor of physics. And I had assumed that because a woman was leading the search, and I was well known as being very much an advocate for women in physics, that I would find it very straightforward to get other women to apply for what is actually, I think, one of the best jobs in the world. I can't imagine things that are actually more fun than teaching people physics and making people excited about physics and learning about physics and encouraging people into physics. So I was horrified when I could not actually get other women to apply for the position. And the reason they were giving me was that they did not want a job like mine. They did not see it as being friendly to work-life balance. They did not see it as something that they could have a kid and actually be a successful physicist. They did not see it as a great environment to work in. And I am just going to be honest that I realized pretty much after I had had a lot of talks with social scientists like Elaine and people who are much more aware of the research than me, I went through a phase where people would tell me that I didn't look like a physicist, and I took it as a compliment. I assumed what they were referring to was the fact that I would wear smart clothes and my socks would match and I didn't wear a pocket protector. And I realized with some horror at it was an awakening for me after this experience, not being able to recruit people in, that what they were telling me was I didn't belong. And I was just not smart enough to realize that that was the message they were telling me, because I had been socialized in a way that I did belong, and that helped. So at that point, I began to become much more conscious about the fact that we would not accidentally end up with reasonable numbers of women in physics. We had to do something much more strategic and be much more cognizant of what was actually going on and driving people out of the field. So at that point, I started to really study the literature, and I realized that what I thought were personal experiences were actually group experiences. And at that point, I became much more active in this area.
Interesting, Patricia. Thank you for sharing that part of your journey with us. Tara, what does that look like for you? What was that critical moment?
Thank you, Vanessa. So for me, as I said earlier, I started teaching in the United States. And after 8 years into the teaching, this was at the point where No Child Left Behind had entered in, and we were standardized testing, and the focus had heavily been shifted on how do we help our students who were not being represented well in terms of their performance to do better. And so then you had all of the testing. And so at that point I was tired, and I had an opportunity through my husband to just go somewhere else. I wanted to see what I could do differently if I could teach and be successful in another environment. And so for 7 years, as I mentioned to you earlier, I was in Ghana. And so really that critical moment happened when I returned back to the United States in 2014. And my return was based on the fact I wanted to earn my PhD. It wasn't because I was tired of teaching there. I was living my best life there. And so it was difficult. It was a difficult decision to return. But I understood that the educational system in the United States was what I was familiar with. And so for me to earn my degree was the choice that I had to make. So the return is where that critical moment came from, because I had developed and had existed in a culture where diversity existed, equity existed, inclusion existed. And I didn't recognize that I didn't have that in the United States when I was teaching for 8 years in an inner city, predominantly Black and Brown community. And it became overwhelmingly obvious to me when I came back and I started teaching middle school students in the United States after 7 years of being away. That culture shock for me was a lot. It was difficult to deal with because one, I went from a system where students were directed based on student-centered learning. There was, no bells. The students could move in and out of class. The students would eat lunch with you. It was just this environment of just community that I had not experienced before in the United States. And so when I returned and, I'm walking students in a straight line to the lunchroom, the kids couldn't go to the bathroom unless they had it was all of these policies. It was like being in a prison, and I didn't recognize the prison mentality until I, again, left and came back. So that was the critical moment that drove me to the work of DEI. And I used theater of the oppressed, which was one of the strategies, because not only was it important to bring that type of awareness to other teachers, but to my students, that this system shouldn't work this way for you, that you shouldn't be policed and controlled in this way, that education should be open. And I knew that only because I had seen something different. And so that's where that critical moment happened for me in terms of why DEI work became central to what I do today.
Thank you, Tara. It makes absolute sense. It's interesting once you have an opportunity to work and live in places outside of the United States. I think those can be incredibly revealing moments, right? And as you shared, also defining moments. So let's continue with you, Tara. And please, Patricia and Elaine, feel free to jump in afterwards. I'd like for you to share with our audience members, what does the science and technology landscape look like right now for women of color, and why?
Absolutely. Without throwing out numbers, we all know if we don't, it's not equal, it's not equitable, it's not representative of our society. There are very few, as Elaine had started earlier talking about, the physicists in the population. I can name the ones that we know by hand, and that's just unfortunate when you think about the talent that's out there. And so the landscape is dismal. And part of that is because, one, the solutions that we're applying to the underrepresentation is not matching the problem. The solutions are directed at fixing the individual and not the system. And so until we figure it out, until we start directing solutions that are fixing the system and not the individual, then we're going to continue seeing these numbers being what they are, which is not representative of the talent that exists across diversity.
Patricia, I see you enthusiastically nodding your head.
Yeah, I absolutely think it is the system, right? I mean, we have an issue, if you look at Arizona, very few of the teachers who teach physics in Arizona high schools actually have a physics background. That's one of the things we're working on here. And if you are in an area that is under-resourced generally, that means that you are less likely to come to Arizona State ready to go into physics. And that is a disadvantage that puts you, several places behind in the race at the start. So there are a lot of changes we need to make at a lot of points in the system. We might be able to save people one person at a time, but when you save people one person at a time, you've got to continue doing that. If you fix the system, once the system is fixed, it is a self-perpetuating solution. So it is just smarter to look at the systemic issues than it is to keep on. You want to focus on the individuals right now, don't get me wrong, because while we're fixing the system, you definitely want to not paying attention to individuals. But over time, we just have to make sure that we are doing the right things at all stages to ensure that people get a chance to meet their potential.
Thank you, Patricia. So let's talk a little bit about some of those challenges, right? For example, um, I've read a book that really struck me in some ways, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And as you mentioned, Patricia, he talks about the structures, right? The structures that have been in place and the policies. And as Tara mentions, those are really the issues and the things that we want to take a closer look at. But it's not easy. I would say that after the summer of 2020 and the protests that swept across the United States after the death of George Floyd, many industries finally said, okay, we need to take a serious look at this. But again, this is not work that is done overnight. I'd like to hear from our panelists what recommendations or thoughts that you may have in order to really begin that process of tearing down those kinds of structural barriers in science and technology for women and for diversity members. I wonder if Elaine has thoughts on that, and we can certainly move down the panel.
Yeah, I come humbly and slowly. I think that you are not looking and not paying attention, or you don't care if you haven't been just shaken to your core by the kinds of things that have happened this past year, and the long overdue call for racial justice, and particularly an end to anti-Blackness. And so these things have an impact on science. And I don't think that the majority of scientists are thinking along these lines. So first, I do think that there is an enormous value in awareness. I mean, I didn't believe, I mean, I studied these things and I was shocked, several years ago to find how few Black physicists there are at top research universities. And this is someone who's, a sociologist who is predisposed to being attentive to issues of inequality. And so awareness, I do think, is really important. I do think as well, secondly, that we need to change structures from the very beginning of the educational system until the end. So we need wraparound programs at the beginning until the end, that inequality really reproduces inequality. And we know from other kinds of research that people are likely to go into science, say, if they have a parent who is a scientist, or if they know people who are scientists. And when you do studies of children who are in poverty, both men and women, both boys and girls, as well as especially underrepresented minorities, Black and brown people who are in poverty, you find that people are very unlikely to have a parent who is a scientist, and even to know a scientist personally, and that their image of a scientist is not someone who looks like them. And so these things start very, very young in the educational system. So I want us to talk about universities, because I know this is a session geared towards universities, but I also don't want us to forget that inequality starts very early. And as scientists who have achieved some measure of success, we also have a responsibility to think about the deep inequalities that prevent people from even considering science as a career. So I'll stop there. I could start going with my lecture here, Vanessa. I can feel it coming. I'm a professor, but I need to let others speak who know things too. So you just cut me off when you need to.
I don't want to cut you off right there, because I feel like you are touching on so many important points there, Elaine. Again, sort of the early start, the breaking down of those structures, the importance of representation and of people seeing themselves reflected in professions and careers that they envision for themselves, and that unfortunately may not have enough representation. And yes, we can talk about that for hours, but I know that I think Tara would like to jump in here and add some of her thoughts as well. So I'm curious to hear what you have to add, Tara.
Absolutely, thank you. So really what I want to get at the heart of this conversation is, it's really hard for us to conceptualize what doesn't exist. And so it's really interesting when we think about the approaches that are taken to DEI work they're uncreative. They're the same processes that we use in the traditional system that has created the problem. And so part of what I'm seeking in the work that I do is we need to change the approach to how we go about training and how we go about even messaging what that DEI work looks like in our community. For one, part of what we're doing is non-experiential. When we talk about DEI work, we're asking individuals to engage in professional development, which most times is detached from them. They're reading a book, they're reading about other people's lives, it's removed from them. And so therefore, they're not invested in the same way if it were more connected to their lived experiences. And so part of what I suggest and what I do in my work is provide that experience. And I mentioned earlier, like through Theater of the Oppressed. Theater of the Oppressed is based on liberatory education. Like, how do we help individuals see those who are oppressed, and how do we help individuals see the oppressor? And it's easier to ask an individual to understand or even talk around issues of diversity when I've provided you an experience. And so Theater of the Oppressed uses the body, and it's connecting the body with the mind. And that's something that we don't do a lot of in education. We just ask people to think, and we don't ask them to use their body, which is another way of helping them kind of tap into the issues that we're dealing with. And so for me, I feel like if we're really trying to do DEI work, and if we want to do it, we got to unlearn that we can't keep doing the same strategies that have been the source of the problem. We can't ask individuals to read someone else's story and feel moved by it when we haven't given them an opportunity to experience what it feels like to be oppressed or to be the oppressor. I can talk to you differently when I've had an experience with my body as an oppressor, where I might not have never had that experience before, and tell you what that feels like. Then I can appreciate what the other individual might have experienced through that. And so my biggest thing is we really need to reframe how we go about training people in the work of DEI and how we go about having conversations about DEI.
Can I just jump in? That really touches a nerve with me. I think you're really on to something there, that people can't know what they haven't experienced. I have a funny, quick story. My daughter's in a public school near her house that is a magnet school for the arts, actually, and it's just our zone school near our house. And she was doing her math work one day, and she's like, "I'm gonna dance this out." And I was like, what are we talking about here? You're going to dance math? And she's like, yeah, our curriculum is like all integrated, and we're just she didn't use the word curriculum, of course, as a 9-year-old, but she's like, this week we're doing math. And so we're doing math and dance and math and art and math. And I was like, and obviously I am uncreative, right? Like I was like, oh, that's wrong, or that's not what you're doing. You must be wrong. But just to kind of raise people up with this idea that diversity and inclusion, especially when it comes to issues of science and math, it needs to be so integrated with the rest of our lives. I just think that's such a great insight, Tara. I just want to say that. I love that insight.
Yeah, and I want to jump in too, because I think what we're getting at here is, if you look at, say, a standard physics faculty, it is predominantly white men, and they sort of assume that there is something natural in that, as opposed to being unnatural, right? We all grew up in that environment. It's hard for people to challenge what they don't see. And I think part of this is, I'm just going to be honest, right? You've got to use the arguments that the scientists get, as opposed to pointing out, well, this is very different. It doesn't reflect the demographics. Because their attitude is going to be, well, does that really matter? Because we're doing physics, and physics is physics. So I spend a fair amount of my time trying to look for analogies and ways in that will reach them where they are. So there's this great analogy where you talk about, what happens if you find a single fish dead in a lake? And what you might say, right, is there was something wrong with that fish. If you find a few fish dead in that lake, you start to say, well, maybe it's the water of that particular lake, and we've got to investigate it. If you are finding fish who are dead in every lake in a region, then there is something systemic going on about the groundwater of that region. And we are in the situation where there are dead fish in essentially every lake that we look at in terms of bringing people into science and engineering. And that is it sounds like a bizarre way of describing it, right? And I apologize for those of you who do not like thinking about dead fish, but it gets scientists thinking about this is a systemic issue, not an individual issue. And I think it is really, anybody who studies how you change people's minds will tell you, you want to find a way of finding a point of contact with those minds, as opposed to going straight at them and ending up in a shouting match. And I think that is so close to what Elaine and Tara are saying, right? You have got to start figuring out how to get everybody concerned about this issue.
That is so true. That is so true, Patricia. I know you and I were talking about this before when we were preparing for the panel, but this idea too that science itself is hurt when we lack a diverse scientific workforce. And I think that speaks to scientists, but I just love what you're saying about trying to help scientists understand from where they're coming from. You know, we know that problems which are simple, yes, groups that are not diverse, they can take those problems on, and that shared cultural heritage helps them. But boy, when you get complicated problems, you need diversity in the type of people who are bringing their insights and their social locations to bear on those problems. And the world is facing complicated problems right now. The world is facing complicated problems. And so we need an incredibly diverse scientific workforce to bring us answers to those problems. And so that's just so well put.
And if I might add too, I love that analogy, Tricia, on the fish. And apologies for those who don't. But the thing is that as you were speaking and sharing that, what has happened if I were to transfer that over to Black and brown girls of color in the field being the dead fish, what has happened is we've normalized that so that it becomes not an issue that is even of concern that we even investigate. So I took your analogy and I said, let me situate that within the context of this conversation, STEM education, and replace with fish, the girls. And is there that same sense of urgency? That is what's problematic for me, is that it doesn't have that same impact.
So I'd like to take a quick moment here because I don't want to lose the flow of this conversation. Again, you're hitting on really key points there, but we do have an audience question and also audience comment. And so I'd like to continue to encourage our audience members. We have almost 50 actually right now joining us live. Please send in your questions, your thoughts, your comments, and we will happily share those. So here's a question for the panel. In what ways has the lack of diversity in these fields limited the advancement of STEM fields? How do you imagine that STEM fields will be impacted by advancing inclusion? So we'll tackle that question first.
Just two quick things come to mind, if that's okay. So there has been some great work done in the history of science, and even something that we take for granted now, such as refrigeration, really started to pick up when women came into science in greater numbers because their roles were fairly limited to home, and they thought a lot about food and how to keep food cold and what that meant. And so you saw sort of a direct relationship between social experience and the advancement of scientific technology. And so we don't always know the way in which diversity and really intentionally increasing and providing opportunities for people will lead to scientific breakthroughs, but there's some great examples in the history of science that come to mind. The other thing which quickly comes to mind right now is in terms of addressing the pandemic, which we're all thinking about. We do not see many Black and brown scientists or women scientists of any racial group as spokespersons, really talking about vaccination, really being interlocutors to different kinds of communities. We do see some, and I want to acknowledge that there are trailblazers out there, but the voices that we hear most often are not from these groups. And we also have a lot of medical mistrust and scientific mistrust in our society, which is very well placed mistrust, meaning that people have been discriminated against and victimized at the hands of science. And so especially we need people of color and we need women in the scientific fields right now to advance science. And I just see right now, I think we're being burned to some extent because we've not done more in these areas. And so we do see the consequences, sadly.
Patricia, did you want to add something to that? I believe you did.
I did. So the first thing I want to say is it's always hard to argue the impact of absence, right? Because women have been so absent, it's hard to say what we have specifically lost by that. But there are some clear areas. For example, if you look at automobile engineering, which was mostly male until the late 70s, 80s, car accident dummies were built to basically mimic large male bodies. And if you looked at the rate of people dying in motor car accidents, it was significantly more likely that as a woman, you would die in a car accident than as a man, you would die in a car accident, correcting for things like distance driven and everything else, because people did not realize the importance of doing things like adjustable seatbelts and steering wheels that adjusted. And when women came into car design, the numbers of women dying in car accidents decreased dramatically. But that didn't just help women, that helped anyone who was differently sized than the average large man was. And I think there are a lot of examples in medical research where people did not realize that, for example, with drugs, you do not just change the amount of a drug you give somebody according to their weight. It makes a big difference if you're a woman taking that drug or a man taking that drug, or your ethnicity can have an impact. So we are just starting to scratch the surface. But I do think that a major area is sustainability. There is a lot of evidence that when you start bringing women into a discussion about sustainability and climate change, they will make decisions that are good for the community as opposed to good for individuals.
And I'm going to throw an amen on my behalf right there, to quote Elaine. So let me share a comment that one of our audience members has put out there. This is coming from Lisa. And she says, and Patricia, the analogy of the dead fish is so wonderful. It strikes me as incredibly important for we who desire DEI to learn the language necessary to advocate for change. So I wanted you to know that, because Tara, you're not the only one who's enjoying that analogy. So here's sort of where my head is at. So I know through my own work, right, in DEI, that there are a lot of really good intentions out there, right? And a lot of well-meaning people and a lot of people who do genuinely recognize we need to do this. We need to change structures. We need to bring in diversity and be more inclusive. However, I have found challenges along the way. People sometimes tend to say, well, that doesn't really impact me, right? So what can I do? And so the word I think about is buy-in. That's where I always tend to focus the majority of my work. How do I get buy-in, not just from the people who are being directly affected by these issues, but by the people who, again, may not feel identified or connected. And there comes that sort of concept of empathy, right? I wonder, in the fields of STEM, what would you recommend? What have you seen in your journeys that has been effective? And if you want to share some of those challenges along the way as well, feel free.
Thank you. So a couple of things, the buy-in, to your point on the buy-in, There is a pattern that I've noticed, particularly in STEM education, when we're trying to create more interest, create more self-efficacy, create more content development knowledge for those who are considered traditionally not represented. The tools that we use, culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally sustaining, culturally responsive, I ascribe to all of those. I believe that they're helpful tools, but what I notice is the misrepresentation of what those tools are meant to do. Often they're used as a way to help develop student engagement and encourage their motivation and interest. And there's an element of that that is missing, which is that social political consciousness development. I spoke earlier about we need to disrupt the structures, the systems that are creating these inequities. And part of that work has to also happen from the individuals who are being impacted. And if I'm not preparing the girls of color to understand the systems writ large and to be able to advocate for themselves and to know what to do, it doesn't help when we talk about promoting these different tools like culturally responsive if we leave off the social change aspect of the critical consciousness, the movement aspect of it. So part of what I've done and what I do in my research and work is how do I help individuals conceptualize better what culturally responsive pedagogy looks like in terms of the social political aspect of it. And earlier, I mentioned theater of the oppressed. Theater of the oppressed is another way of helping individuals take something which I consider culturally relevant pedagogy is abstract, because it's something that has been packaged as the panacea for helping those Black and brown kids be better and have better opportunities, but that's only one part of it. It's not the whole thing. And so theater of the oppressed, arts-based methods where we're encouraging more use of your body, connecting it with your mind, where individuals are able to make contributions differently, because what's happening is that education has standardized what we know as the correct answer, how we respond, and that standardization has not included Indigenous people. It has not included other communities of culture who use their body, who have different ways of expressing themselves. And so those are some of the strategies that I would say in order to get buy-in, you got to give people experiences that are outside of the traditional norms.
I think
Elaine.
about buy-in, that is, I do want to really acknowledge the what Tara has said about thinking outside of traditional norms. And Patricia raised this as well earlier, that there's a sense where we're using the brokenness of the system to fix the brokenness of the system. So we need to kind of get out of that thinking. At the same time, we do need to be convincing scientists, as Vanessa is rightly saying, that these things are worthwhile from multiple standpoints. So I like to try to understand where people are coming from, what's important to their groups. Maybe this is how I think as a sociologist, and then give them an argument and some tools that make sense in their particular cultural context. So if we're talking to a group of scientists who are part of the dominant culture, then how does diversity make sense for the aims of science itself? So how will a diverse workforce help us solve scientific problems? Our undergraduates right now, I hope there are lots of undergraduates who are listening. I find this generation of undergraduate students to be very engaged in issues of justice and to be motivated by concerns of justice. And they really want to know how science can do good in the world. And so then I'm having a different kind of conversation than I am with established scientists that have been at it for 35 years often. And so to just think about different kinds of arguments and different kinds of practices as well. And then another thing related to buy-in is giving people who've been in science a long time new tools for thinking about how to do mentorship. I have noticed often that people of color in particular at my university and other universities I've been part of end up doing their job. And this is very true for women of all racial groups and all sexual orientations in different kinds of domains. Anyone who's marginalized, who's trying to bring people of their group into the dominant space is going to be doing their core scientific work, plus this whole other job that's like 40 hours a week called doing diversity work. And so we have to understand the kind of long-term lack of sustainability that brings. And what is it going to mean to share that burden and that very good goal around? Now, some people are particularly equipped to do this work, and some people have no clue. And I hope it's okay to name that. And I know, and I say that humbly, that there are areas in these last months where I was like, I had no clue. And I want to acknowledge that. But how can we bring people along so that work gets shared a bit more equitably in doing the work of diversity? Because I don't want our colleagues of color, and I don't want our women who are marginalized themselves and are already facing battles within their domain to then feel like the load is all on them. So how can we, again, this is an organizational question that we need to be thinking about. I am so sorry, Vanessa. I feel like I'm getting a little preachy.
Not at all.
I was like, and then she gives a sermon. Not
at all. I will tell you what you are saying, Elaine, quite frankly, is not unique to science and technology. I see it in the journalism space.
Oh my gosh, yes, yes.
And with colleagues from other schools and colleges, they're also facing similar challenges. Again, this is an understatement. This is not easy work. This doesn't come naturally. Again, we're trying to break ways of doing things and structures that have been in place for too long, quite frankly, too long. And again, that does not happen overnight. And you talk about that additional work. That's what we call the invisible work, right? That so many times goes unnoticed, undervalued, right? I want to share with the panelists some comments and some questions that are coming in from our audience members now. I love this one from Lori. She says, this feels like an approachable conversation between four smart, compassionate women who I wish were my friends. We're friends, Lori. We can be friends. Lack of this dynamic is a barrier in itself. So again, I wanted to share that with you because sometimes it really just takes an honest, authentic conversation to make someone feel like they're a part of something. Something as small as that can go a long way. Olivia shares, discouragement kept me out of M&S. I suggest that curiosity and dispelling that rules are sometimes a barrier to curiosity, which is the ultimate turn in learning. Here's a question. Can we change the schools to introduce M&S earlier as fun and amazingly full of new ideas waiting to be found in those schools? Patricia, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so I actually had circled Olivia's name on my notepad because I wanted to give her an amen. As somebody who is a physicist and finds physics so exciting and to address questions that are so interesting, I am absolutely behind the argument that at some point, if you look at 3-year-old kids playing, they're curious, right? They're excited. They're exploring their world. They're trying to figure out how things work. And at some point, we sort of drive that out of them because we have a sort of set of these are right answers. So I think one of the things, it's sort of a confidence issue, right? That if you're teaching a subject like physics, sometimes the wrong answer that you've got to through the right reasoning pattern is actually better than the right answer, which you are conceptualizing in the wrong way. But we are so focused on getting the right answer that we are ignoring the thought process that you use to get there. And I actually am going to share something from the point I realized I was going to become a physicist. Was I did an experiment to figure out how big atoms were. And, I did the experiment, right? And then I was so excited about calculating that it, how big this atom was, because this was like thrilling, right? I did not know that I could figure things out for myself by doing experiments before this point. And these were in the days where you didn't have calculators and you did long division. And I did this calculation of the size of an atom. I must have done like 20 significant figures, right? And any scientist would tell you that that was a bad thing to do, because the answer, the best I could have done was 2 significant figures, and I didn't understand experimental error, and I didn't understand this, and I wasn't doing that. And I had a teacher who understood that I was thrilled about what I could find out, and didn't think that this was the time to explain experimental errors to me and all the constraints on how I should actually have done the experiment better. And I would hope that everybody can get a teacher that understands when somebody is excited about something and doesn't see it as their job to explain why they shouldn't be that excited, because they really just showed that they didn't know what they were doing. So Olivia, I am absolutely with you. Let's work for excitement and understanding that science really is fun.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. I love that our audience members are now getting warmed up and putting questions up in the chat. So here's another one, and this one comes from Pauline. As someone in the health professions, those of us in nursing, for example, predominantly this is known as a profession of women. Well, we face a different challenge where we have had not only to establish an identity in healthcare and the university system, but also open opportunities for men in the profession as respectable. I think this is really interesting and something that we should also talk about, right? We're focusing a lot on women and other minorities, but certainly in this case, there's that opportunity for us to be open-minded, to connect, to empathize in new spaces, in this case, for example, nursing and men. So I find that comment really interesting, Pauline. Thank you for sharing that. So let me ask the panelists, where do you see women and other minorities in science and technologies, let's say in the next 10 to 15 years? Do you have any recommendations for women and other members of diversity communities who are entering these kinds of fields? Elaine, let's start with you, and then we can go down the panel.
There's a, just in response quickly to the comment about nursing, there is some interesting sociological research that shows when men enter traditionally female dominated careers, that they actually rise more quickly to management positions within those careers and leadership positions. And so that's an interesting kind of gender disparity, which can go on as well. And care work, and I'll lead into answering the second question. Care work is something that we have seen traditionally in our society as the province of women, which is why there are more women in nursing, sociologists think. And I want to pause briefly to thank our nurses in these times. Our nurses have been at the forefront of giving excellent medical care. It brings tears to my eyes because I have several family members who are nursing, and this has been extraordinary work in our society in these times. So thank you. There is a sense where women and underrepresented minorities are much more drawn for good reason to the pieces of science which seem to be helping society and which are more what we might call the applied sciences. So for example, you do see actually more women and underrepresented minorities in some fields of engineering than you do in theoretical physics. And this seems to be a kind of trend. And I get it to some extent, because people who have seen injustices then want to use their professions to rectify those injustices. I would like to also see more space made for underrepresented peoples in the more basic science fields. And I can speak about why I think that's important. Some of these fields are at the forefront of really charting the way forward for science, what kind of science is being done. And I do think we're losing something when those pieces of science are not made the focus of diversity as well. So I think both are important, but that's where I see a bit of a growing edge when we think about the science, the mapping of the scientific landscape.
Tara?
So I mentioned earlier, part of the solutions that we're adding toward trying to correct the problem has not really addressed the problem. And so when we really look at underrepresentation, the real issue of why it is what it is really a number of reasons: lack of access, the biases, racism, power inequities, all of these factors which are not being named and called out and dealt with to deal with this underrepresentation issue. And thankfully, when I think about myself, I'm a scientist, I'm a Black woman. I hit all the indicators of individuals who are not, basically who we're speaking about today. I am that person. And so you ask, well, am I a unicorn? What's so unique about me that I am here in this space and that I'm able to hold a position in science where we're talking about individuals who are not? And I attribute that to the fact that my dad was a scientist and that I grew up in a culture and an environment where he pumped me up so much to know that I could do it, that his encouragement was so much so that when I did face racism and sexism and all of these biases, it just kind of like bounced off me because I had been inundated so much with the reality that I could do. But not everybody has that. And so part of what the work that we can do, and I hope to see in the next 10 to 15 years through the work that I'm doing, is that we create these programs, which is part of what I do with CompuGirls, where we're working with girls of color and we're exposing them to coding and the different forms of STEM technology in a fun environment, but we're also connecting them to social political consciousness development. We're showing them the connections to the inequities that exist for why they are so few and how the benefits of STEM education can create a better life for them. And so earlier, I know you had asked the question about the impact of the absence of diversity. Well, that impacts my well-being. That impacts my quality of life. Not so much I expect all my girls to be STEM, go out and be physicists or, mathematicians, but I do need you to know some things about these areas because it does impact you when you take medicine. It does impact you in all the areas of your life. So it's much more than just creating a workforce that has representation in that way, but just recognizing that we're in a pandemic and I'm able to inform myself on decisions about how I manage my life in this time because I have that background. And that should be something that everybody has access to.
Before we move forward, I just want to make sure if Patricia, if you had anything you'd like to add.
I have a couple of quick comments, right? The first is, I think we've got to work to make spaces for people to find people who think or can at least talk to them in ways where they feel a member of a community. And I think we're getting better at understanding the importance of that. I think there's another couple of things too. I think we have an admissions process and gatekeepers to make it onto science and engineering where we have not thought whether we are looking for the right qualifications, right? For example, there is an exam in physics called the Physics Graduate Record Exam, where if you look at that exam, it's a multiple choice exam that very rapidly tests if you're good at answering questions very rapidly. There is essentially no correlation between that exam and how likely somebody is to be successful in a PhD in physics. And yet we use it as have been using it, but we're stopping using it now. We're using that as a qualification instead of thinking about it is harder to design a holistic approach to admitting people into physics, but it is better to have an approach that brings more people into physics who are going to be successful in physics. And I wanted to pick up on a comment Elaine made about people being drawn to certain areas of physics. They are the more applied areas, but they're also the areas that tend to be done in larger groups. And I'm wondering if one of the things is that they are finding communities there of people who are accepting, as opposed to, for example, theoretical physics, where there's this idea that you have to be a genius like Isaac Newton. And we don't think enough about how privileged Isaac Newton was for his time to be able to write the Principia. So I think there could be multiple things going on there. I think if we could build the sense of community and move to the idea that you learn how to be a physicist, you're not born to be a physicist, that we might actually move people into some of those areas that we don't see much inclusion right now.
Elaine?
That's a great point. And I want to try on for the group and the listeners the idea too, that communities and group dynamics are extremely important in scientific access. There's been some initial study, for example, looking at how much men and women interrupt naturally in conversation. And in some areas of science, there is a lot of interrupting. This is sort of new research that hasn't been done very widely. So I don't want to name the areas of science or something and then, kind of bad list something.
Sorry, Elaine, this is not unique to science. Just putting that out there.
I know. But it is interesting. I think this disadvantages certain kinds of men as well. And it's women in general because of lots of different reasons, but in particular, the way we have been socialized to what communication specialists call to be turn takers. So I talk, but I want to make sure you're heard too. And so I'll say like, oh, you haven't talked a while. What do you think? And men are not socialized in this same kind of way. Typically, certain men are more than others. And I want to acknowledge that. And so we may be disadvantaging a whole type of person that's especially good at working in groups. And maybe women are more likely to be part of that group of people, if that makes sense. But we're disadvantaging some men too in setting up a culture like that. So just thinking about, I think Patricia kind of got me riffing on, like, there's all kinds of things about group dynamics that we need to be thinking deeply. And then Tara's ideas about, this is a kind of out of the box way of thinking about something like it, maybe a simple intervention is teaching people how to be better turn takers in conversation in university academic life. And what does that mean in terms of making sure multiple voices are heard?
Excellent. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, Elaine.
Touche.
Okay. But I couldn't help myself when I was hearing you speak about just something as seemingly innocuous as interrupting. Again, it's not unique to science at all. Lori has another comment I'd like to share with all of you. Tara's comment makes me wonder what public health practices and policies might look like if women and people of color had a place in STEM history. Right? Think about that. All right, so I'd like to now pose a question to the panelists, and hopefully that will help some of our audience members, because I'm getting the sense that we have a lot of women watching and a lot of women who are excited about science, and they're looking for perhaps new and additional ways to break through into certain fields. So I'm thrilled about that, and I'm thrilled that they're joining us. So can you tell us basically, what are some of the things that you have done, for example, in your careers that have added value to the success of women and women of color in STEM education and careers? So if you could share some of that with our audience members, I think they would find value in that. And perhaps Tara, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you. So one of the things I mentioned earlier, tools. What tools are we using? Let's think out of the box. And so I want to give a new close example, something that's really relative and hopefully be coming out really soon. But the movie Hidden Figures. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie, enjoyed the movie, or didn't enjoy it, whatever. But the idea is I took that movie at the time that it came out. I was a middle school science teacher in the state of Florida. So, the space program's there. And so you have all of these connections. And so, again, it's this idea of how do we create new ways of thinking and being and learning so that individuals understand the social issues that are reflective of the lack of representation, and also think of ways of how they can not only just be aware, but then move forward to change those structures. Because I think sometimes we sit in this sphere of awareness and we go, that's really bad. And we don't feel like we know how to move from that awareness towards action. And so that's where I try to, again, present opportunities for individuals to see that awareness. So I'm really heavily into critical media literacy. And so one of the things that I did and what I do is I evaluate the textbooks that we use for our students. And not only am I evaluating it, I teach my students to go through the books and recognize the inequities, not so that they can just be enraged and say, okay, I'm not going to read these books anymore, but so that they can present solutions and advocate for themselves. And so when the movie came out, as we all know, it advertised these hidden figures, these 3 prominent women that they showcased, if you didn't see the movie, who were significantly important to the launching of the space program. And so I remember the movie came out, I was excited about it, great. And every year before that movie had started, I was teaching about the history of the space program. And I remember I asked my students, will not forget, it's page 269 of the textbook, to open up their books and let's look at the history of the space program, as I had always taught it. And it was, if you could just imagine, it was a timeline, and it had white males on there, and it had the years going across, and that was pretty much it, the representation of it. So I asked my students to tell me, what are your observations? And so I let them throw out these observations. They see a timeline, they see men, but it didn't click until several iterations of it. And I said, how many of you have seen the movie Figures? And then they said, oh, I saw it, in excitement. So I said, now please go back and look at the page again. And what are your observations? So this little exercise became an aha, like, oh my goodness. Well, we don't see, they call Taraji, which was Katherine Johnson. We don't see her there, and she was important. And where is the other people? So what I'm saying to you is, how have I been successful? Part of what I've done is introduce opportunities along with my own self-development, development of my individuals that I'm engaging with, of strategies, being aware of the things that might have just missed us, because it had missed me before the movie. That this representation of the space, history of the space program, had made me think about the space program differently. So I encourage you in the work that you're doing. It may seem overwhelming, but I sure know I got 78 kids at that moment who are now looking at the book differently, who are now thinking about representation differently because of that experience. So that has been something successful, is looking at the tools that we use. We all use videos as educators. We all use text, literature. How can we use those examples to our advantage of showing how to dismantle the systemic racism that exists in genderism in our society? So that's my suggestion.
I love that, Tara. I love that. I mean, the simple act of always being conscious and having the awareness, right, can make such a huge difference for ourselves and for those who are around us. Patricia, I'm interested in hearing this part of your journey in the world of physics. I can only imagine that you may have some interesting examples to share.
Yes, so I think one of the things for me has been an awareness that I needed to rely on the social science research. Because that moved me from viewing this, as I said earlier, from an individual issue to being a group issue. And that has been tremendously important to me. So I have spent a fair amount of time thinking about how you develop the policies that make it easier for women and women of color to move into a space. I will also say, and I think we need to own this, that the first marginalized group that made progress in physics was white women. And I think we had a tendency to assume that if we could solve the issues of white women, we were solving everybody's issues. So I also want to say that one of the things I have learned is to understand that intersectionality makes this problem, which is already complex, another level of complexity to it. So I am always grateful for people who can, like Tara, who can bring that wider perspective in. I think what I just want to say is I think it's important to choose your battles wisely. So there are a lot of times where I think you might suspect that the issue is somebody doesn't respond to you well because you're a woman. But I think you need to figure out when is it important to work with somebody and work within the system as it exists to make progress on a long-term goal like policy. And when is it at a point where there is just an ethical reason that you have to say is enough, and I'm going to react to this. So it is important always to remember that if you want to be a physicist, you have a right to be in physics. And look for your allies, but decide who can help. There are issues that I can take on as a chair that students can't take on. There are issues that actually students can take on because I'm with you. You were saying earlier, Vanessa, the energy of this new generation coming in is amazing, and their understanding of the issues and their willingness to deal with these issues. And there are times where I feel the best thing I can do is to stand back and let them do it. And there are times when they should recruit me to be an ally.
So much to unpack there, so much to unpack there. But I want to give Elaine an opportunity to add her thoughts before I circle back to some of the things that you just touched upon, Patricia.
Yeah, it's hard to know what I would add to these excellent statements. Those were really, I was just taking it in. That was a lot. That was very, very good. A couple of things I would add. I have mentored quite a few PhD students now. And when you go to conferences, any kind of academic conference, even in my own field of sociology, where we say we study social inequality, there is a lot of who's who looking around. There is a lot of positioning oneself and, who comes from the good school and who doesn't. And you find conversation circles at conferences where people will literally look at your name tag to try to figure out if you come from a place where you're worth talking to. And so I always tell my students, when you're standing in a circle talking, you make it your business to step back and let whoever is standing on the outside of the circle step in. And that empowers you and it empowers them. And so, no matter if you're just starting out, there'll be someone who wants to talk to you, who wants to be included, and you have the power to step back and let someone in. And so I think thinking about symbolic practices is one kind of thing I think about a lot as a sociologist, the kind of symbols that we uphold and how we can start getting new practices going. And again, think outside of the box a little bit. And then the other thing I've been reflecting on a lot is really to something Patricia said. When do you need to make a point to fight for your own power? So some of us do come from marginalized groups, and there are situations under which I have definitely felt discriminated against or othered consistently because of an identity, where I thought, given my position, where I am in the academy right now, I need to speak up here. I need to do something because there are other people who have less power than I do who would not be able to do anything about this situation. So I need to make it my business to do something. There are other times I've been increasingly realizing that I'm the one who's enormously benefiting. And how can I make myself more aware of the conditions under which I'm really benefiting because of my social location, and I need to give away power? And what are some practices where I can just open my hands of my power? And that's hard. That's really hard, because I think as human beings, when we get power, we want to snatch it. And even those of us who say we're socially conscious, and I've been kind of having a reckoning about that lately. And so, when do we need to say, yes, people like me are here, and you need to pay attention to us? And when are times in which we need to say, I'm going to hand that over because there's someone else who needs to pick it up, and I have the ability to give it away. So I've just been thinking about that. There's not an exact right answer, but there's some things I've been thinking about lately.
I wonder if it's possible to clone this panel and just because I will share with you with what you just said, Elaine, and also Patricia. You know, Patricia, you mentioned picking your battles, right? And that is something, again, that in this space of DEI is so critical, right? Navigating that system and thinking strategically on what moves you're going to make in order to sort of reach a bigger goal, right? At the end of the line. But that is exhausting. It's exhausting. And a lot of times, I think for women and minorities, you sort of say to yourself, well, why do I have to do that? Why do I have to be the one to always be strategically thinking how I'm going to win at a game that I did not have a voice in creating, right? And so I just wanted to throw that out to the panel. I think a lot of our audience members may understand what that feels like and the frustrations and why sometimes people say, you know what, this isn't worth it, right? And then we lose on talent, on bright futures. And again, not just in the fields of science and technology, but across the board. So just something that I would throw out there to consider and think about. We have, I can't believe it, the time has flown by. This has been such an amazing conversation so far. We have just over 10 minutes left. Something I had asked earlier is for those who are considering a career in STEM, they may be women, they may be minorities of another kind, and also for the allies who are watching and who are listening. What advice would you like to give them in this time? Kara, let's begin with you.
For me, I would just say be okay with who you are. One of the things that was helpful for me, as I said earlier, my dad was a scientist. And for me, it was his encouragement, his development of my identity, speaking truth to life, like who I was, how successful I could be. It was that really defined me. And for me, I was okay moving in spaces that weren't welcoming at times because I made sure that my presence was going to be an annoyance to other people. I wasn't going to allow their lack of welcoming and hostility towards me push me out. I wanted them to know that I still own that space as much as you, and that there was an equal sharing of that space that needed to happen. But then I also make sure that in claiming spaces that I'm not replicating oppression that has been developed against me. So I want to make sure that I'm clear when I say I'm seeking equity, but I'm not seeking it at the expense of being inequitable in how I present opportunities for all. While I'm shooting for girls to be more represented in the area, I don't ignore the males that are also present. I value them as well. And so I try to make sure that I check myself in terms of my own particular biases. Why did I respond? I know that I have a certain positionality as it relates not only to my gender and race, but my religion and my ability. All of these things play a big part. And so I try to make sure that I'm constantly reflecting on those things. How is my behavior encouraging or discouraging others in that field? So while I am here to speak about how can we increase representation and how can we promote DEI, I'm also acknowledging and saying that I also have to constantly unlearn the things that I have learned in my own practices that help the process of keeping people out, excluding, and all of those things that we're saying that have not been helpful. So I guess the best thing is to be comfortable with who you are. I like to norm difference. Like, difference is great. And just be okay that you came up with an idea or an example, or your answer was so far off the mark that it wasn't even close to what other people thought. I'm okay with that because it's my idea. And I'm different. And because I'm different, I might not have the same ideas as you. So just be okay with who you are as an individual and embrace that.
Trisha.
So I'm trying to think how to follow that. I would say for me, there are two things. One, I very much give myself permission to do things that restore me. So if I enjoy reading a book, or I enjoy having a long hot bubble bath, or I want to go out with a group of friends for a great meal, there are times when I just know that I need to take that break and do something restorative. So I am not a big fan of being a physicist 24/7. You can tell I enjoy being a physicist and I'm excited by physics, but I do things that are not physics, right? That put me into the real world. So if you want to survive, you have to find some things that give you joy, that you will turn to, that will renew your energy. And I tell people that I don't think about managing my time, I think about managing my energy. If I'm going to do something that is draining, I want to do something that is restorative too. So that's just giving people in the audience permission, I think, to occasionally say, you do what is best for you, and go there and do not ever regret doing things that just give you joy. The other thing I would say is I think we have to work at making allies allies. So we have probably, I suspect everybody on this panel has been in a position where somebody says something offensive and everybody else knows it's offensive, and they look at you because they view it as your job to respond. I would say if you are looking at somebody that you think has been offended because somebody said something that you think is offensive, you should respond, right? And it's not until they start responding and telling their colleagues that, you know, they may also be a white male, but they are as offended by this statement a white male is making as anyone else is going to be offended. So we need to start sharing this load. We need to start saying it is not the responsibility of the marginalized to fix the issues of the marginalized. It is the responsibility of the majority.
Elaine, and thank you for that, Patricia.
Those were excellent responses. We're kind of have a trope here of saying, I don't know what to say next because those who came before me were so good, but it's true again. Yeah, I think that if you're thinking of going into science, who are your supporters? So who are the people who are your team? So who's your team outside the academy, the people who really love you for who you are and want what's best for you? And I think that's really important. So I think that's one thing that has been an absolute saving grace for me so far in my career as an academic in the social sciences. And then secondly, and I think my colleagues have said this as well, that there's, what causes you joy in your work, and how can you do more of those things, and find ways to let go of some of the other things. I mean, I think when we really experience joy, that we're bringing our best selves to our work. And so I would say, don't let anyone take away your joy, if that makes sense. That's really, I think that's something that I wouldn't have said in my 20s, but in my 40s, that's become really clear to me, especially this past year. I think that's really, really important. Don't let anyone take away your joy. And then thirdly, I think that diversity in science and really honoring that is a long haul game. It's not right now. People are really worried about the optics, and people are over responding in a really weird way, wanting to make themselves look good. And I'm sure I've fallen prey to that as well. No one wants to be called the racist. And, but what does it mean to really commit to diversity in all its beautiful intention for the long haul? So what does it mean for people or the majority to get behind a more diverse scientific workplace? What kinds of practices, what kinds of mentoring do we need? So I just think that there's like a need for the call for the long haul, if that makes sense. And so we get away from And I think the cost of not seeing this as a long haul situation is that we in the majority, and I'm definitely in the majority in many areas of my life, and I definitely have power in many areas of my life. We are kind of like, oh, we hired someone from a minority group. It's like one and done. And we don't think much, we don't think very much about structures and how they need to change, as Patricia and Tara have been saying. And we don't think about the cost to the person who's been hired of being the only one and needing to take up or feeling like they need to take up the mantle. And so I've been thinking, and being the only one who does so, I've been thinking a lot about how can we who have power provide really generative opportunities. So what does it mean to provide a really generative opportunity to someone? So I think of people who are junior to me, what can I give folks that's generative? And I've just been trying that idea on a lot lately. Like, what is the best opportunity that I have within my power to give someone else? And I want to say that with a lot of reticence, because I'm sure if my mentees were to listen, there are times when I have massively failed. But I hope to just keep having that conversation with more senior colleagues. What are ways in which we can provide generative opportunities for people?
That's, I think, a really good way to start wrapping up this conversation. Again, I can't believe it, but we have just about 3 minutes left. This is day-to-day work. This is not just now or in the next 6 months, and like you said, one and done, and we move forward and we did our job and we're good. No, if we're going to be successful in the DEI space, and I really want to emphasize the E and the I in that, right? I think those are really important. We talk a lot about diversity, but inclusion and equity, I think, are probably more key, right? If we
very
really
much
want
so.
Permanent structural changes and policy changes. Quick plug, I'm being asked to mention to our audience members. So the lunch and learn sessions will be starting now in about 3 minutes. So they'll be posting the link for that. So if our audience members want to join that, there it is. Joe Martin, you can click on that link for the lunch and learn sessions. Okay, 30 seconds. I want to make sure our panelists have the last word. Because I think I could sit here for another hour and a half easily and continue this conversation. So Patricia, 30 seconds that you'd like to leave the audience with.
We need you in physics, and you are welcome in physics. And if you do not feel welcome, let me know and we will make you welcome in physics.
Sarah.
Use creative methods to increase representation. Let's not use the traditional frameworks that have been suggested in the past and present, but let's be creative. Let's think out the box, and let's understand that the problem that needs to be fixed is not the underrepresented groups, but it is the system.
Elaine.
I think sadly we're seeing the consequences of the lack of a diverse scientific and medical workforce right now. And so I hope we learn from that, and we really see hope in diversity, that having a diverse scientific workforce is not a loss to some, it's a help to everyone, and it benefits our society. So yeah, that's what I would say. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for the privilege of listening to your perspectives, your expertise, your guidance, and your advice. I have some quick comments from Jim and Olivia, who shared that they have enjoyed this conversation tremendously. Thank you so much again for joining us. For our audience members, I hope this has been a conversation that you have enjoyed. I know I have. So it's been my honor to moderate it with these incredible women. Thank you for joining us. And again, thank you for doing the work that you do, not just in your chosen fields, but in this important space as well. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.